as security practitioners. I don't think we can continue doing this work thinking about all the worst case scenarios that could happen in the personal, local, national level without giving ourselves space to breathe. And so I think that's why it's important that we embed this continuum of care in our organization and our workplace cultures.
That's the voice of Lovely Umayam, a nuclear nonproliferation expert, writer, and founder of Bombshelltoe Policy and Arts Collective. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here is your co-hosts, Tom Collina and Lauren Billett.
And welcome back to Press the Button. Tom, as always, it's so nice to see you. How was your weekend?
Hey, Lauren, great to see you too. I had an adventuresome weekend. I drove from Washington, D.C. to southern New Hampshire, which is always an experience. We have an electric car. And so driving an electric car, if you leave the I-95 corridor, you sometimes get into a rather thin distribution of chargers, shall we say, and they don't always quite work out as you leapfrog from one to another. So we managed to get stranded, but in a pretty nice place. We got stranded in the Berkshires in Massachusetts. So we just wound up staying at a overpriced, very nice bed and breakfast. And that solved the problem. So now I am in New Hampshire, where it's a very nice place to be. How was your weekend?
Well, I'm so glad that you got there okay. Traveling woes are no fun, as I know as well. My weekend was spent recovering from traveling out to San Francisco last week for our annual gala, Chain Reaction. So I traveled from the East Coast out to California to help behind the scenes with Chain Reaction. It was a wonderful event with fabulous speakers, and Tom, you hosted one of the panels, so great job, by the way. It was a hybrid event, so there was the watch party in San Francisco, but largely the event itself was virtual so that everyone around the world could watch. And the recording is now available on our website at ploughshares.org/chainreaction2022. So I encourage you, all of our listeners, to watch the videos and learn how you can take action on nuclear weapons now. So Tom, what do you have for us on nuclear news this week?
Well, the big news is on the Iran front, where last week the Board of Governors of the International Atomic Energy Agency voted to censure or criticize Iran. And Iran retaliated by announcing that it would turn off 27 cameras and online monitoring systems at its nuclear sites. Rafael Grossi, the Director General of the IAEA, has confirmed that the cameras have been disabled. And Grossi said in a CNN interview that his agency might no longer be in a position to confirm the peaceful nature of Iran's nuclear program. So this is indeed a very serious move that Iran has taken. And of course, as our listeners know, negotiations to revive the 2015 nuclear deal have stalled over the fate of the foreign terrorism designation of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps due to domestic political pressure on both sides. But just to remind folks, according to analysts, Iran is still about a year away from manufacturing a nuclear weapon if it chooses to do so. Lastly, China's defense minister said that Beijing is building up its nuclear arsenal, a move he said is justified by the current state of international security, and warned that Beijing will fight for Taiwan's independence. This is likely a direct response to President Biden, who recently said, yet again, that the U.S. would defend Taiwan militarily if China attacked.
As always, there is so much happening. Tom, what do you have for us on early warning this week?
Well, I sit down with Sahil Shah. He is a policy fellow at the European Leadership Network in London, and we will discuss the news I just described about the IAEA Board of Governors vote to censure Iran. We'll talk about Iran's response and what it all means for the Iran nuclear deal, so please stay tuned.
And then Ploughshares Fund President Dr. Belcher sat down with Lovely Umayam, a non-resident fellow with Simpson's Blockchain and Practice program. Their conversation focused on Lovely's Lifelines project, which is a collection of personal reflections about the experiences of nuclear policymakers and technical practitioners during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic.
And if you like what you hear, please remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback, as always, helps us improve the show. And with that, let's get into the episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
The UN Atomic Energy Agency's Board of Governors passed a resolution last week criticizing Iran for failing to cooperate with an investigation about its past nuclear activities. This, unfortunately, has set off a new crisis with Iran as it retaliates against the agency's actions. In a press conference after the vote, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi, said that Iran was planning to remove 27 surveillance cameras from its nuclear sites. Grossi said Tehran's actions pose a serious challenge to his agency's ability to monitor Iran's nuclear program. Iran has also said that it is planning to install hundreds of additional centrifuges at its Natanz site, increasing its uranium enrichment capabilities and posing a fresh threat to the already slim chances of reviving the 2015 nuclear deal. Here to help us understand the developing situation, we're joined by Sahil Shah. He's a policy fellow in the European Leadership Network in London. Sahil, great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So first, can you explain what prompted this censure resolution and what the censure is meant to do?
Absolutely. So for starters, it's important to note that there are two simultaneous tracks at play, like has been the case at many different points in the saga of trying to come to grips with Iran's nuclear program. First is the negotiations on the nuclear deal and trying to get that restored. And the second are more of the historical activities and past activities that Iran has conducted that questions have arisen over, namely because of the Israeli atomic archive in recent years. The resolution has to do with the latter. So the IAEA has these outstanding questions related to traces of nuclear material that were found at various sites in Iran. And in March of this year, the agency and Iran agreed to a step-by-step process that would lead up all the way to last week's June Board of Governors convening that would hopefully give some more robust answers as to what happened to that material, why that material had been there in the first place, where it went. This is really a material accountancy issue. However, even after this whole step-by-step process, which was indeed executed by both sides, the agency still felt that they didn't have a technically credible set of answers from Iran. So the resolution is a response to the Director General's report to member states, especially those sitting on the Board of Governors, which essentially said exactly that the truth is that the agency is not happy with explanations that Iran provided on these past activities and on the resulting material accountancy questions. And the resolution, it passed with an even stronger majority than the one that was passed 2 years ago in June of 2020. So there's clearly an increased support now 2 years later for a resolution that essentially supports the agency's efforts, but calls on Iran to cooperate in a more constructive way.
Now, even though Iran presumably saw this coming, and even though the censure resolution text, by some people's estimation, is not that extreme, Iran is taking this quite hard and is retaliating quite strongly. It is announced, as we mentioned, it would turn off surveillance cameras and install new centrifuges. How significant is this, and what additional steps might we see Iran take in retaliation?
So we really now are finally living in a world without the JCPOA, because for a long time, Iran was continuing to implement the deal, despite sanctions being imposed by the previous US administration. And then they were slowly walking back the nuclear commitments, including those related to verification and monitoring. So by getting rid of these 27 cameras, they're only implementing what they have to under their Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement, or CSA. So the message is basically, we're not going to give you anything more than what we need to under that agreement, and certainly not anything under the JCPOA. Those cameras were important because they primarily surveilled centrifuge part assemblies, production, research and development, etc. So since February of 2021, Iran was no longer handing over the footage, but they were at least continuing to have the cameras on. Now they've pull the plug on those cameras, and we no longer will have that additional layer of insight. This doesn't mean that we have absolutely no insight into Iran's nuclear program. It means that that additional layer of comfort that is needed really to keep the JCPOA alive and be in a place that it can be restored is now no longer there. So one of the other things that they've done is they've also stopped the online enrichment monitoring system, or OLEMs, which is actually a US kind of invention. And this basically measures enrichment levels in real time, basically that's in the gas flowing through the pipes. And the data that's collected is transferred to a computer for analysis. And then when the IAEA inspectors go to Iran, they collect the data from there. So that data is sort of seen as a full historical record of enrichment levels that have taken place at a facility that would then have to be correlated to Iran's own declarations of what it's done. It's not perfect, but it does create some redundancy in addition to measuring the enriched uranium inventory at the end. So again, it's not the only thing in place, but it gives that additional assurance. Outside of that verification and monitoring, as you've mentioned, there is now the installation of 2 additional cascades of IR6 centrifuges. This was indeed already planned, but the fact that they've actually now are in the process of doing it is quite serious, because those machines are up to 8 times more effective than the older IR1 model. So what we're seeing basically in summation is lower verification and monitoring insight, higher enrichment capacity, and a degradation of trust, which was already pretty much in limbo between the agency and Iran, because it's a very politicized issue, especially because the information that led to this inquiry and resolution is from this Israeli atomic archive. And these things all together, although they're meant to be part of a separate track from the JCPOA negotiations, they certainly provide the backdrop for whether or not it's possible for these parties to bridge the gap.
So give us your sense of what this all means for the prospects of the United States and Iran getting back into the Iran nuclear deal.
Yeah, that's a great segue. I mean, it was quite shocking that last week that the Director General of the IAEA, Rafael Grossi, actually put a timeline on the JCPOA's chance at surviving. He said, further from 3 to 4 weeks from now, it'll be quite difficult for the agency to be able to give the parties in the JCPOA a baseline in terms of where Iran's nuclear program is at, should the deal be revived. So although there's certainly ways that they could try to establish a baseline after that 3 to 4 week window, it would be a much more arduous effort and one that may not result in as much accuracy that everybody would want. So we have a ticking clock on the JCPOA. In recent months, even all the way to the beginning of this year, you had the US and E3 partners, the UK, France, and Germany, and others saying, in February, the JCPOA's nonproliferation benefits are going to be little to none. Then we passed February and we got into March. Then we got into April. So at this shifting goalpost in terms of a deadline was always seen as something that was really politically motivated to put pressure. However, now that we have the head of a UN technical body coming out and saying, actually, after this point in time, my staff's ability to give you a baseline is not going to be there, that may do one of few things. It could either generate the necessary pressure to get the Biden administration to make a gesture and finally get this over the finish line, or it could give ammunition to the critics in Washington who will basically look at it and say, well, what's the point anymore? Especially as we reach the end of that 3 to 4 week timeline. So I think it's going to create a huge amount of turmoil in DC, to be completely honest. And I think Iran really will just sit back and they will escalate. There's no political goodwill left really between the parties involved. But the good news is that there is a mutually accepted text on the table. It's been sitting there for the past few months. The issue now, though, is trying to get the Biden administration, I think, to make some sort of a bold gesture and, perhaps figure out a way to alleviate some of Iran's concerns that they won't really be able to see those economic benefits that they were always entitled to under the JCPOA. So if there are some additional assurances, additional comfort that can be given in that regard, I think that could, in the end, really get this done. But at the end of the day, like I said, it all comes down to political willpower. And I'm not sure how much is left in the White House on this issue.
Sahil Shah, thank you so much for being here. Great conversation. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Shing, the Communications and Marketing Specialist at Ploughshares Fund. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has exposed just how close nuclear escalation and nuclear war can be. To meet the urgency of this moment, Ploughshares Fund has launched a donation match challenge to make the largest grants possible to those who are working every day to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons. Right now, all first-time gifts will be matched dollar for dollar, and all new monthly gifts will be matched at their 12-month value. Or increase your giving and the full amount above your last gift will be matched. Go to ploughshares.org/donate today. And thanks for listening.
Today, we're doing something a little different. Here on Press a Button, we talk about nuclear policy and the impact it has on our collective safety and security. But this time, we're going to flip the script and talk about the people who work on nuclear policy and the impact that their work has on their lives. So, I'm joined by Lovely Umayam and Elisa Reverman to discuss their recent work, Lifelines, Experiences of Women in Nuclear Policy During the COVID-19 Pandemic. Lovely is a nuclear nonproliferation expert, writer, and founder of Bombshelltoe Policy and Arts Collective. Elisa is a PhD candidate at Georgetown University and occasional illustrator. Thank you both for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So first, I want to say thank you to both of you for this contribution to our field. It's a powerful piece of writing and art. And we're more than 2 years into the pandemic. From the likes of it, it's not going away anytime soon. And everyone's got to really grapple with this reality on their own, but also collectively. It's got broad-reaching implications for nuclear and national security work. So, Lovely, for our listeners who may not have read Lifelines yet, can you give us a sense of the goal of the project and how it's structured?
Sure. So Lifelines is a project between Bombshelltoe Policy and Arts Collective and Gender Champions in Nuclear Policy, or GCNP for short. And it's essentially a collection of anecdotes from women working in nuclear policy about how COVID affected their personal and professional lives. It started out as a survey conducted by GCNP back in, I believe, November 2020. And at the time, they received more than 200 responses from different individuals within the field, some identifying as men, some women, some gender non-binary, all working in government, academia, the NGO community, and also in various stages of their career. And while this survey was heavily qualitative, I think it captured this really unique and important moment in time when the nuclear policy field, much like other sectors and disciplines, were forced to situate its work within the context of a global disaster. But given that the field's work revolves around this notion of protecting the world from an existential threat, there was a very intense disorientation that occurred, particularly for women scholars and policy practitioners and even interns. You know, it raised this question of what does it mean to champion security when we cannot even provide that for ourselves, as more women take on childcare responsibilities at home, or even feel more disconnected or disenfranchised as their workplaces transition to telework. So I want to make clear, though, that Lifelines is not suggesting that only women struggled during COVID. Of course not. We all sort of experience this collective grief, regardless our identities and backgrounds. But I think what Lifelines does is it acknowledges a subset of that human experience, explores why the pandemic may feel especially sharp for a certain demographic, women, given the long-standing struggles of equality and autonomy even before the pandemic times. And I also think that Lifelines sort of assert that this is an important artifact and piece of knowledge that will inform the trajectory of the field if we're actually going to take gender equity seriously. And then to your question about the structure, GCNP approached my arts collective, Bombshelltoe, to help present the survey results in a digital format that conveys the emotional power of these stories. We wanted to move away from the PDF report that is limited to just a presentation. And so we decided to create a website that features a selection of responses to the survey, all anonymous, as well as feature 4 longer stories by guest contributors, paired with these beautiful illustrations created by Elisa. So, the web design itself sort of flows from one story to another.
So, Elisa, how did you weave the themes of the project into your illustration?
It was challenging. So Lovely and I don't actually know each other as peers in the nuclear security field. I'm actually doing a PhD in analytic philosophy and epistemology, but we are rock climbing friends. And Lovely knows me more as an artist. I occasionally share stuff on Instagram that I just sort of do for myself. And I was really excited when she approached me to do this project because, like what you mentioned with the PDF, a lot of my work in philosophy, the end format, the end product is an essay discussing very abstract topics. There's really zero aesthetic consideration at all. And so I was really interested in taking the content that Lovely has expertise in, as well as these other essays, and producing something that was visually demanding and sort of had the aesthetic and design aspect sort of at the central core of part of what we were trying to convey. It was interesting and it was challenging. I mean, a lot of these essayists or even people writing into the anonymous survey were sharing really similar feelings of this inner tension and turmoil and sort of these abstract emotions that didn't even play across as in a facial expression exercise. They were complex emotions that I wanted to try to convey. And I wanted to keep a kind of uniformity across the visuals as well. So I stuck with a pretty specific palette, and there are a couple of motifs that I like to use throughout. So I had a lot of playing with sort of this shatter idea where I would do a little illustration and then I would break it up into little pieces. But I also wanted the pieces to keep the form. And so you knew what it was of, but you could very clearly see these fissure lines. And I thought that was really representative of what a lot of people were experiencing and talking about in this essay, which was, reaching a breaking point, if not passing it, but also kind of trying to keep together the idea or the role that they're supposed to be playing and sort of moving along, even though we're all experiencing this collective trauma. So I played with that a lot and trying to sort of just pull in uniformity through textures and the colors and these motifs, but then lend specificity to the particular locations or other themes that they had brought up in their essays.
In collecting and reading the essays, did anything surprise you? Lovely, let's start with you.
So I'd like to answer this question as a reflection on the process of making the lifelines with the essayists rather than maybe the final product. What was illuminating or surprising to me was how uncomfortable it was to write in first person, especially in context of nuclear policy work, while collaborating with the 4 essayists. So shout out to Anna, Chantel, Victoria, and Anu. We really couldn't have done this without them. There was this recurring challenge to allow our respective personal voices to come out through our writing, not only because writing in this format is already a skill, right? But also because it felt somewhat transgressive or inappropriate, since the nuclear field is inherently allergic to the word I. Nuclear policy and international relations more broadly has come to accept that the universal and objective unit of analysis is state behavior, which is rooted in sort of this Western positivist realist way of understanding the world. And speaking for myself, when I engage in first person writing, I can't help but feel this sort of tinge of reluctance, which comes from the fear of not being taken seriously because I'm presenting information that doesn't align with the traditional criteria of knowledge within the field. So in developing Lifelines, I really had to find role models to help me and the other contributors feel comfortable in engaging this project. And one of those role models was Jan Tickner, who for decades championed this methodology of investigating the lives of those on the margins as a way of understanding the development of IR. And of course, women fell into that category. There was also an expert named Monica Sakur, who I actually cite in the introduction of Lifelines, who articulates sort of this idea of autobiographical international relations, which is the use of personal narrative to identify and call out exclusion and erasure in the IR field. And of course, there's the writings of Carol Cohn, which have been incredible, powerful first-person reflections. And without her work, I don't think we in the nuclear field would have been able to name the concept of techno-strategic language the way that we do now. This is to say that in the end, Anu, Anna, Chantel, and Victoria brought to the table something that's incredibly powerful and courageous that I don't think a lot of people in the field could do, precisely because we're told not to. I don't necessarily want to pick a specific essay because I think all of them brought that to the forefront within this project.
Thanks so much for sharing those reflections. Lovely. Elisa, how about you? Anything surprise you in collecting and reading the essays?
Yeah, definitely. Before I started reading them and just going into the project, I expected to really have to do a lot of research and just expect to sort of feel a little bit behind coming in as like not a nuclear person. It's not my expertise. It turned out to just be the case that while these women were all writing really different essays from different locations, literally and socially, there was just like an undeniable sort of thread of commonality between all of them. And it was just interesting to see how the specificities and details of everything they were discussing were really different from each other. But there was a deep sense of relatability in that all of us were feeling sort of precarity in some kind of way that was deeply stressful and sort of affecting multiple layers and aspects of our lives. And so I think I expected to feel a little bit more overwhelmed and perhaps sort of out of my depth when reading these essays and going through the survey results. And what I ended up finding was actually that being able to speak in that first person and to speak from a particular social location and a particular viewpoint, while it might not be relatable in that I haven't been in that particular situation, it was actually like deeply relatable. And it really translates knowledge in a powerful and interesting way when it comes from that personal perspective. And I think that the essayists just did a really amazing job with that. So while I expected to sort of feel like an outsider looking in and trying to, visually start to make sense of something that I was detached from, I think their essays were so honest and powerful, and it ended up being a lot easier for me to find this common ground and find something that I think any kind of audience member could find relatable.
Thank you. So I'd like to turn to a few specific themes of the essay. One's a lack of control or certainty, and the other is luck. And these elements have played a huge role during the pandemic. But there are also themes when we think about the threat of nuclear weapons, where lack of complete control poses a threat to our security and luck has prevented catastrophe. So this parallel is kind of striking. I'm wondering, though, Lovely, how do you think about this? Do you see a parallel?
So I think it's interesting that you picked up on this element of luck in the stories that we feature in Lifelines. For me, it actually manifests in two ways. And I'll mention the first way, which I think directly ties to this question about risk prevention and ultimately survival. In the context of COVID, some of us cannot help but feel lucky to be here today after 2 harrowing years of the pandemic. And similarly, I've heard the same language used when we reflect on what we've come to know as nuclear near misses in the field, including the instances when early warning systems malfunction that could have easily escalated tension between the US and the Soviet Union back in the 80s, or perhaps more prominently, the Cuban Missile Crisis, where organizational decisions acting on incomplete information could have easily cascaded into war, but it didn't. And sure, we truly get lucky, but I would also hope that undergirding what we call luck is work, like anticipating what we can control through some sort of preparation. So during the pandemic, even when we didn't have clarity of information, we tried to implement public health guidelines to minimize risks like masking, vaccines, social distancing, and using all of these tools and not getting sick shouldn't just be chalked up to luck. And I think in the end, that's just called preparedness. And similarly, I think nuclear weapon states need to actively strengthen security protocols to prevent near misses, or better yet, maybe come together as an international community to envision a world without nuclear weapons. That would be an ideal, rather than sort of trusting that nuclear war won't happen because it just hasn't happened yet. Now I think that's really leaning in on luck in a way that feels irresponsible. So that's the parallel I see in both scenarios, in the way that we think of threat and the amount of control that we have. Like, we can't control everything. We can't minimize risk to zero, but we shouldn't just heavily rely on this idea of luck, because if we do that, we will eventually run out of it, I think. It is complicated because it's really easy to try to poke holes in that argument. But I think part of the issue is that we're all experiencing this in real time. I think that we need to review this again 10 years from now, 20 years from now, to really understand what the connections are. I think that we're still too close to the situation. We are still literally experiencing it as we speak, for us to really fully comprehend how this is changing us, not only as people, but also concepts like security or risk.
Lovely. You add an update to the introduction that reflects on this work in the context of the war in Ukraine. You write that such events can serve as a reminder that we cannot just erase the struggles of the past to give space for the struggles of today, that there's a continuum of care that we deserve. Can you talk more about this and how you think we can do a better job as a field in recognising the marathon-like approach we must take for our care?
So for a little bit of context, I decided to write the updated introduction to Lifelines as a way to acknowledge the fact that it's just incredibly difficult to compartmentalize grief. We like to pretend that we can decouple the individual from the work. But when the work is specifically about security and protection, which is the case in the nuclear policy field, it's impossible to ignore how insecurity accumulates within ourselves, our immediate communities, and in the world. So when Russia invaded Ukraine back in February, and in the following weeks when Putin announced that he would be placing Russia's nuclear forces on high alert, the nuclear policy community was expected to just take in all the questions, explain what was happening, contemplate the likelihood of war. And perhaps there were some experts where it felt like a seamless transition from one threat to the next. Perhaps it's the much needed diversion to think about something else. But I feel like for most of us, we were just still tending to our wounds the past 2 years. And we really had to find a collective moment to acknowledge what happened to all of us and how it's going to change the field. And I guess what I wanted Lifelines to be is an example of a project that recognized that sudden shift, that we cannot sweep the last 2 years away. I personally think that it would be irresponsible to do so as security practitioners. How can we not take a beat and learn something about what happened to humanity in a great moment of insecurity? I really believe that we can no longer sort of do security work that isn't informed by grief. As we've seen in the past current events, it's not just COVID, it's not just the invasion of Ukraine. It's also a lot of grief at home. And I think our discipline needs to change such that we are considering our level of precarity of having to digest and process simultaneous threats. And I think there's something to be learned from that. And part of learning that is giving ourselves the space of being cared for as security practitioners. I don't think we can continue doing this work thinking about all the worst case scenarios that could happen in the personal, local, national level without giving ourselves space to breathe. And so I think that's why it's important that we embed this continuum of care in our organizations and our workplace cultures, because we will break if we don't as human beings, which then impacts the way that we do our work as experts if we don't have that as a resource.
Elisa, what will sit with you most after working on this project?
For one, it was just an honor and pleasure to work with the essayists, as this project gave me like a unique sort of opportunity to talk with them a bit and to get to know them and work on illustrating their essays. It's not necessarily like a simple takeaway from working on the project necessarily, but it really was just amazing to get to know them and to speak to such interesting and accomplished and intelligent women. But I think the main takeaway from this project that I found personally, but also I think something that translates to a lot of different fields, if not almost all different fields, is just that, and Lovely touched on this earlier, but I think it's typically thought, especially the higher up you go in levels of expertise, that the personal aspects of something are distracting or detracting, and they kind of degrade the quality of information in what is being discussed. When in fact, I think often when it's done well and when it's done carefully, it's enriching and it actually informs and it adds to the knowledge that we have about something. And so part of what I loved about this project is that it really emphasized that aspect of the personal narratives and the personal experiences of something really enrich the knowledge that we have about it rather than serving as sort of a distraction from it. And I think that that's just a takeaway that more fields could recognize, including my background in philosophy, but also lots of other kinds of fields in STEM and other areas of scholarship. I think that the value of personal narrative and personal experience really deserves a lot of value and attention and careful merit.
Thank you so much. And Lovely, where do you hope the field goes after this work and the revelations from it?
I do want to acknowledge that there is now a lineage of individuals and organizations demanding for a change in the same ways that Lifelines is sort of promoting, beginning with New America's Consensual Straitjacket, as well as the works of GCNP and Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security in our field. The primary takeaway that I would want our listeners in the field more broadly to reflect on is recognizing Lifelines as a worthy, credible body of work in the field, the same way that one would treat the new report on how many nuclear weapons exist in the world, or the policy debates about the likelihood of Russia escalating war in Ukraine. And if in this thought exercise you sort of bristle at that idea of this being a source of knowledge, legitimate knowledge, I think that that's worthy of examination as to why. Because I think we have to really think about who makes up this field. And it's humans, it's us, and the quality of our work will depend on how we feel like we're cared for and seen by our peers and how we put value on ourselves. And so, yeah, I think one of the biggest revelations for Lifelines is that there are many different ways that we can produce knowledge and give knowledge. And part of that, as Elisa said, it's just really centering the self in a beautiful and respectful way.
Well, thank you very much. Where can people go to see Lifelines if they haven't already seen it?
So it's actually part of the Bombshelltoe website. So if you go to www.bombshelltoe.com/lifelines, it'll be there. You could also check out the Bombshelltoe Instagram, which is the handle is just @Bombshelltoe, and there are links to the project there. At the moment, it's best viewed in desktop. And so we recommend that you use your laptop to scroll through the stories and illustrations of Lifelines.
Well, thank you both for a fascinating discussion and really terrific work on bringing Lifelines to life. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us and sharing our work.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett, Angela Kellett, and Alex Hall. Audio engineering in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.